Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Dr. Charlotte Peterson, author of The Mindful Parent: Strategies from Peaceful Cultures to Raise Compassionate, Competent Kids. Dr. Charlotte, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Well, we are thrilled to have you. Are you ready to begin?
I'm ready.
All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
Well, I found that for me, it was really important to have a time and a space where I was able to get away from my normal life. I mean, I did spend every weekend and holiday for 6 years writing this book. But my most productive times was when I rented a cabin in the mountains or at the coast, and I spent 1 week every 6 weeks and just devoted that entire week to writing. That I found was most helpful. And also, I made a commitment with a friend. We were in our 60s, and he had always wanted to sing on stage and have a band, and I always wanted to get a book written, and we made a commitment that we would be champions of each other. So when I was having a hard time, he would show up and he'd give me a pep talk, and he was sort of like, he called himself my corner man. He'd patch me up and send me back in the ring, and I would do the same thing for him. And I think that was very helpful.
So I just think you mentioned two of the best strategies that I've seen, because one of the main things is when you're writing that book is to be able to disconnect. So one of the things that I've done in my own books and I always recommend to my clients is, if you are going to do it locally, if you're going to do it at your home, office, wherever, first thing you got to do, you have to disconnect. You got to turn off the Wi-Fi, you got to shut off your phone, and you got to turn off the TV to get rid of all that static, and going and spending some time, as you mentioned, away and just being able to focus. That just makes all the difference. And the second thing is that you had an accountability buddy. That's the next level right there too, because you had someone there to keep you accountable, to be your cornerman, and to support you through that journey. Those are brilliant strategies.
Yeah, that was very helpful.
Excellent. Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Well, I had no knowledge of how the publishing world worked. I was my undergraduate work was in mathematics. I was a psychologist. I'd never written a book. I never even thought I would write a book. But I was doing presentations about what I had seen in countries all over the world in terms of how to raise kind children, especially the peaceful cultures. And I decided people kept asking me for a book, so I started writing it. But I had no idea how the publishing world works. So I think reading, researching, listening to your podcast. I wish I'd had your podcast when I was writing mine. Asking other authors about how the system works, and networking was a really good, important part for me. I had a young editor. Since I felt my book's audience was going to be younger people, new parents, I had a young editor who had liked my book, but then she moved to New York to begin an ebook launch. And she happened to be at lunch one day, mentioned my book to a friend who was an agent. The agent called me, and I never thought about having an agent, but that was a very important person because she was instrumental in revising the book, promoting it, finding a publisher for me. And then the publisher offered me an advance. But the publishers choose the title, the format, the book cover. I didn't know all that. And a publisher was also promoted it nationally and internationally. Since people in Western countries, most of them speak English now, my book was able to be promoted in the European countries in English, but my publisher also was able to find a South Korean publisher who translated my book to Korean, and I had an international publication in Korean that's available. And another thing that I didn't know, Paul, is I didn't understand it, especially as a first-time author, that unless you self-publish, that the amount of money you get from a book is pretty minimal. The bookseller gets 50%, at least this was my contract. Publisher gets 25%, agent gets 15%, and the author gets 10%. So for every $25 book I sold, I got 250. So I didn't realize that I wasn't going to retire on the money that I made from a book necessarily.
Well, and I think that's one of the biggest reality checks that a lot of people get when they're doing their books. Because, I was thinking the same thing starting out with my first book, where it's like, yeah, royalties are going to be great. And they were. I mean, we did really well. First book I had was a bestseller, and our other books did the same thing. But one thing that I've realized is there's so many books out there. And yes, can you make some decent money on the royalties? Yeah, you can do okay. But you make the life-changing money when you're focusing on the back end, when you're tying this with your business, when you're using this as a conduct to promote yourself, promote your business, your brand, and having a clear offer that goes with the book. So that's where you really do make the money. And I always tell people, if you're just looking to make royalties out of this, then you're going to be in for disappointment, because you have to be able to run this not only like a business, but you also have to not be afraid to get out there and do podcast interviews or do radio interviews or go on summits and those type of things, because you do have to be able to sell it. You can't just expect, if you're going to use a publisher, that they're just going to do all the work, because that just doesn't happen anymore. And as you mentioned, if you are going through a publisher, your cut's pretty minimal compared to some other opportunities that might be out there.
That's right. That's right. But if I'd self-published, I don't think I'd have the exposure that I got from a publisher. So I was glad that I went that way. But yeah.
It definitely is a balance. Well, what I want to ask you about is marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that has worked well.
Well, in my book launch, I was fortunate that I was able to have an interview on our local NPR station, and also a newspaper interview that was in the city section front page that announced my book signing. I did local book signings at bookstores, at the University of Oregon, local and state organizations here in Oregon that focus on positive parenting. I did all those, a free PowerPoint presentation, and Q&A and book signing, and also developed posters and flyers to publish when and where those book signings would be. And I think that was the most helpful for me.
Well, you mentioned you're able to get on NPR. So how did that work?
It was great. It was our local NPR station. So it was just, I think the audio was just available in Oregon. But there was a nice interview one morning, and about a half hour, and was cut down about 15 minutes, and it really gave local exposure.
Excellent. And how were you able to do that? Did you reach out to the station? Was it your publisher? How were you able to cultivate that relationship?
Someone at the station knew me and asked me if I would like to have that kind of a interview, and I was very glad to have it. So, yeah.
Excellent. And any strategies that you suggest for other people that like to get onto NPR or something else like that?
Well, I think that it just helps to, like I said, network in your community. People that are working for a TV station or a radio station. If you know someone that knows someone that knows someone, just put the word out. Oftentimes they're looking for information too.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned with what we've done with some of our publishing services and our marketing is it's not about reaching out necessarily to the host of those shows. It's reaching out to the producers of those shows, to the editors, because they're the ones that are really the ones that are going to be looking to get that content and to get you booked.
That's right. That's right.
Well, speaking of books, I'd like to know what is your favorite book and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Oh no! Of course, that's a very hard question. Because I've been a reader ever since I was a little girl, and
Yeah.
I would have to say that I have different books that are my favorites for different aspects of my life and times of my life. But in terms of my career-changing book for writing this book that I wrote was probably Marshall Klaus and John Kennel's Mother-Infant Bonding. I just returned from 14 months with a backpack in South America in visiting the indigenous Aztec, Mayan, and Incan cultures, and I was really surprised at how differently they treated their babies from what I had been taught in my psychology classes. And then in 1976, Marshall Klaus and John Kennel came up with this book that really did show evidence-based that when babies were received and there was a close attachment, that it changed their development. But then as I was writing the book, I'm sneaking here in a second book in, Bruce Lipton's book, he's a brilliant cell biologist, and his book, The Biology of Belief, was actually able to give me the evidence-based information that I needed to write a book. I wasn't going to write a book just about my observations. I wanted it to be evidence-based. And he was able, in his biology of belief, in his research, to show that actual genes in a developing baby are selected in response to the environment that is experienced in the womb. Now, Tibetans have always known that, but we didn't have that empirical evidence here. And stressful early experiences actually grow children with larger hindbrains for protection. We need to, the message is we need this child to be able to protect himself. And after birth, and during pregnancy, a low stress and nurturing grow children with brains that are actually able to develop the prefrontal lobe of the brain, which gives you higher abilities in creative problem solving, cooperation, compromise, negotiation, compassion, empathy, and being able to regulate your emotions. So those two books were really helpful for me.
Excellent. And for our final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
My favorite quote is, "It is not our job to toughen our children to face the cruel and heartless world. It is our job to raise children who will make the world a little less cruel and heartless," by L.R. Nost. Oftentimes parents think that they should toughen their kids up to be strong and more able to deal with life, but actually kind people have happier, more productive lives and closer relationships, and that's continually being shown.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Charlotte, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
So my website is www.growingkindkids.com. And my book's available in hard copy, MP3 version, audio, a Kindle version through Amazon, and also the audio version through iTunes.
Well, Dr. Charlotte, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.